Okay, so the presidency then, new institution, new section. As with the other major institutions of the federal government, we'll begin by looking at what the Federalist Papers have to say about them. Remember, the Federalist Papers, again, arguing for ratification of the Constitution, they also explain the institutional design of a lot of these things, whether it's Congress or the presidency or the judicial system, Supreme Court in particular, okay? So if we look at what the presidency, how the presidency is discussed and argued for and justified and explained in the Federalist Papers, okay? Publius, again, remember, actually Alexander Hamilton probably wrote a lot of the important ones here, but Madison too, but Publius, remember they all use the name Publius. Publius focuses on how executive power will be restrained, because again, we know the anti-federalists were very worried about the power of the federal government generally, and it kind of depends. Sometimes they were a little bit more worried about Congress for various reasons, but of course sometimes they were very worried about the president and the executive branch. The king had so much power. We remember that under the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive branch, right? Because they were just trying to avoid that kind of abuse of power altogether. So Publius focuses a lot on how executive power will be restrained in this new system. And probably Hamilton was the one who wrote these. There's a lot of concern, though, that the executive be strong enough to act, okay? So Publius is trying to show the executive will be restrained, the president will be restrained. Nobody needs to worry about a repeat of King George or tyranny of any kind. However, you do have to have an executive that can govern effectively. Okay, so Publius wants to make that argument and show why that's necessary and why the setup that they have under the Constitution will do that best. Okay, related to all of that, questions of representation. Okay, who is the president representing and how will that happen? Okay, and one of the ideas of the presidency and one of the ideas that they argue for is that the president represents the people as a whole. Remember, every member of Congress represents either a specific district or a state. So every member of Congress represents a particular area of the country. The president is supposed to represent the people as a whole. And again, this is something that concerned the anti-federalists and might concern people more recently, that the executive, the notion that they're drawing their authority from the people as a whole, in a sense, makes them more powerful. But the president is the only person, and the executive branch is the only part of the federal government that is supposed to represent the American people as a whole, okay? Not the people of this or that district, not the people of this or that state, okay? So, of course, we know separation of powers, checks and balances. The presidency is independent of the other branches. There were different anti-federalist, or even some federalist proposals to make the president in one way or another dependent on Congress. That maybe he would be appointed by Congress, maybe he would have to be renewed by Congress. But of course, the executive branch, the president, is completely independent, elected by the people, of course, actually by the Electoral College, but basically by the people, and is in no way dependent on the other branches. Okay, not elected by the Congress in particular, not elected by the Supreme Court. It can be removed from office by Congress. We'll talk about that in a second. So the president represents the people directly, is dependent only on the people. The president does have a veto, of course. Again, Congress writes the laws. If a bill passes both houses of Congress, it will be sent to the president. And the president either vetoes it, refuses to sign it, and sends it back to Congress, usually explaining the reasons why, or, of course, can sign it into law. There is a third thing called a pocket veto, where the president, if it's at the end of a legislative session, the president can just not sign it. I think it's 30 days. And if the president just does not sign that bill, it doesn't become a law, but he doesn't have to formally veto it, okay? But the president has a veto. Of course, the King of England also had a veto, but the president's veto can be overridden. The King of England's veto was absolute. His negative was absolute, as they say sometimes in the Federalist Papers. So, but the president's can be overridden. So the president has that, again, checks and balances, separation of powers. The president has that necessary ability to check Congress by vetoing possible bad legislation that they may pass. But they have the ability to override his veto with a 2/3 vote in each house. Okay, that's very rare. Something like less than 1% of all vetoes have actually been overridden. Okay, so it's very rare. It's difficult to do, but it is possible. So if you're worried, as the anti-federalists were, about the president or the executive having too much power and possibly running amok and being a tyrant, the fact that Congress can override the veto is proof that, or sign that you don't need to worry so much about that, okay? Andrew Jackson was the first to really use the veto somewhat more the way that we think of it as being used now. Originally, the view was it should only be used really for constitutional questions, only if Congress is doing something that might be unconstitutional. George Washington vetoed only one bill, and he only did it really because his advisors told him, listen, I mean, in so many ways, Washington kind of set the mold for the president, or set so many expectations. And his advisor said, if you don't use the veto at all, subsequent presidents will feel like they shouldn't use it either. So he only vetoed one bill in 8 years. And before Jackson, it was considered more something that you should only really do if there's a constitutional question. Jackson was the one who started to use it. The way that it's used now, really more like an expression of disagreements about policy. Really more like, I don't like this policy, not like I think this bill is unconstitutional, but more, I don't like this, and I don't think that the people elected me to sign bills like this into law, okay? Getting back to the Federalist Papers, the president, of course, is also the commander-in-chief, which means that he is the head of the military when it is in use, okay? Remember that Declaration of Independence concerns that the king was trying to make the military superior to the civilian colonial political leadership. So commander-in-chief, the president may have a military background, but is not a current member of the military, an elected civilian who ultimately has control over the military. But what that means is when it's in action, okay? It doesn't mean that the president can declare war. We'll talk about this a little bit more with the imperial presidency, but certainly in the Constitution, it's very clear. Congress declares war, not the president. And the president cannot really raise or regulate a military or the military. That is, all that stuff is really up to Congress. So the president is commander-in-chief, the one person who ultimately controls and makes certain executive decisions for the military, but all of the questions about whether there will be a military, how large it might be, when it goes to war, and all these other things, those things are left to Congress. So again, separation of powers and a clear limitation of the president's power, even though he will be the chief executive, okay? Impeachment, it's obviously become more of an issue in the past few years. Donald Trump was impeached twice. Second time, he was not convicted, but several members of his own party voted against him. Other cases, Bill Clinton, Andrew Johnson before that. Richard Nixon resigned before being impeached. He almost certainly would have been impeached and probably would have been convicted, okay? He did things and kind of basically did things, because ultimately when you're impeaching the president, it's about actions. It's not about ideas they may have had. I mean, obviously when you're president, a statement can also be an action. But Nixon did things that he almost certainly would have been impeached and probably would have been convicted and removed from office. So he resigned before any of that happened, okay? But how does impeachment work? The House of Representatives impeaches the president, okay? They initiate impeachment proceedings. And the impeachment itself, which basically initiates the trial, that is done in the House by a simple majority vote, okay? So only the House can actually initiate an impeachment, and they initiate it through a simple majority vote. So if it's, one vote majority, president is impeached. The impeachment then goes to the Senate, and the Senate holds the actual trial. And it requires a 2/3 majority in the Senate to convict the president and to then remove them from office, okay? Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the Senate trial, but it's not easy to impeach the president, but the House can impeach the president, simple majority vote, but it takes a 2/3 majority in the Senate to actually convict the president of impeachment, which removes the president from office, bars him from becoming president again. But the main thing is removes him from office. And that's very difficult, okay? It's hard to actually get that 2/3 majority in the Senate. Donald Trump impeached twice, Bill Clinton once, Andrew Johnson once, none of them convicted, okay? So again, the idea is if the president is really running wild and really is a threat to liberty and really is a threat to constitutional government in the United States, then sure, he needs to be removed from office, but this should not be something where Congress can remove him because they disagree with his policies or they don't like something about what he's doing, okay? So there is impeachment, there is that ability to remove the president, but it's difficult to do. That 2/3 majority in the Senate is often, traditionally, certainly has been difficult to get. Okay, and then finally, Unitary Executive. Again, probably Alexander Hamilton wrote these papers, and here's where he argues that you need a unitary and a strong, as he often says, energetic executive, okay? So the Anti-Federalists, one of their sort of interesting ideas is that the executive should be divided internally, just like the federal government generally is divided into three branches, and you have separation of powers and checks and balances between them. So the idea was the executive branch itself should be divided into a council of 3 people or 5 people, and you would need maybe a majority vote, maybe a unanimous vote in order to actually exercise the powers of the president. Okay. Hamilton's argument was that, or again, Publius, the argument is that's very bad. You need unity. You need an energetic executive who can act. And the idea there is, you know, disagreement is beneficial in a legislature. Okay. Something like Congress, excuse me. Okay, in a situation like Congress, which is going to write legislation and vote on it, you want more disagreement, you want more debate. All of that discussion leads to further deliberation. It produces better, more well thought out, more well-rounded legislation, and of course it checks the majority. It's harder for the majority to get things through the more debate and the more deliberation there is, okay? But it's fatal in the executive. You have an executive to act. One of the reasons you have an executive is to act in a case of emergency. And the last thing you want is paralysis or extended deliberation in that case. Okay, so the executive needs to act sometimes in a case of emergency. Therefore, you need unity. You need one person who can ultimately act, not a group of people who will have to debate and come to some sort of settled agreement over time. The other argument Publius makes, which is interesting, he says unity, having just one president, makes the executive less august, less powerful, less imposing, and also easier to see who's actually acting. So Publius says, imagine that you did have some sort of executive or presidential council, and it was George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin. I mean, as hard as it was to challenge Washington or Jefferson or any of these people, imagine if all 3 or 5 of them were all on this council together. Imagine how imposing that would be, and how difficult it would be for somebody, even a relatively strong-willed, ambitious member of Congress, to say that they're wrong about something. It would make them more imposing, more impressive, harder to challenge. It would also make them less accountable, okay? If you remember that the Anti-Federalists, one of the Sentinel, for instance, argued that James Madison in particular, and the Federalists generally, but Madison in particular, had sort of practiced upon Washington and Franklin, both of whom were able to be fooled for different reasons. Imagine if that were happening with an executive council. Imagine that the executive council was Washington, Franklin, and Madison. And Madison was able to manipulate them to go along with what he wanted. How would you know who was really doing it? It would be harder to tell among those 3 or 5 or 9 or whatever it would be people. It would be harder to tell maybe who was really making these decisions, and therefore who needed to be removed. So Hamilton or Publius argued that energy and unity is necessary in the executive. So you need one person, not a council of people, to debate and, gradually reach a conclusion and a decision in a time of crisis. You need one person who can act if it comes to that. And also, having only one president makes the presidency less imposing, less august, and therefore easier to oppose when that needs to happen. And it also makes it clear to everybody, voters, Congress, whoever, who is actually doing these things, and therefore it makes it easier to stop the person if they are behaving badly, okay? And then finally, the argument Publius makes, or Publius points out, when you're worried about executive power, worried about the president having too much power and able to just run wild with government, Publius points out several very important powers, as we already talked about when we talked about Congress. Several important powers are shared with the Senate. So the power of treaty, the president can negotiate and sign a treaty, but it takes 2/3 of the Senate to ratify it and make it actually a binding law on the United States government. And of course, appointments to the executive branch, and probably even more importantly to the judicial branch, including Supreme Court justices, those have to be confirmed by the Senate. So Publius points out several important powers are shared with the Senate. So another check on executive power, another check on the power of the president, and another reason why people don't need to worry as much as the Anti-Federalists thought.